Hello, how is everyone? I'm so excited to be here hosting the third panel today on the second day of the amazing Beloved Community Global Summit. My name is Goddess Rivera. Let's see, how would I describe myself? I feel like I'm a digital anthropologist. I'm a huge inclusion advocate and by trade a marketer. I'm super excited to be here and bring on some awesome panelists to talk about a really important subject today, which is how media influences mindset. So I'm going to bring up our awesome panelists and then let them tell a little bit about themselves, and then we're going to dive into this. So happy to introduce an actor and philanthropist, Mira Sorvino, rabbi and educational administrator, Ari Berman, and journalist and essayist, Jamil Smith. Hey, everybody. Let's see if we can get them on here with me. Hey, Ari. Yeah.
Hey, good morning.
Hi, how are you? Awesome. Oh, I think Mira, we can hear you, but we're going to get your camera up. Okay, so as we work on that, maybe we can start with Ari. You want to just give a little bit about yourself, and then we can jump to Jamil.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me, everybody. Great to be here with the King Center and on this esteemed panel. I should say I wish I was a rabbi and an education expert. That might be the other Rabbi Ari Berman, who is president of Yeshiva University. I am actually a journalist
oh my goodness, author. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
I was like, oh my goodness, he has an amazing journalist career at Mother Jones and time to be president. I am so sorry.
Yeah, I have been getting a lot of Google alerts for the other Ari Berman, who is the rabbi these days. But I cover voting rights issues for Mother Jones, and I'm author of the book, Give Us the Ballot, about the history of the Voting Rights Act from 1965 to the present day.
My deepest apologies. I was thinking that you managed to do all that at once, which was extremely impressive, but I am still very impressed. So my apologies. And Jamil, let's jump to you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Goddess. I'm very grateful to be here with my friend Ari and on this panel and to talk about what I think is an incredibly important subject. So good morning from Los Angeles and looking forward to the conversation.
Amazing. So I know Mira is probably going to join us in just a second. We'll get her back on. But maybe we can start jumping in a little bit and then we can have her just introduce. Okay, amazing. So I know we're talking about today sort of how media influences mindset. There's been a lot of conversation and I think just a lot of discourse about what this means and what type of media should be influencing, is influencing. So I think about it, and the way we're describing this panel today is sort of what we take in affects what we put out, right? And I think it's interesting because it's a really simple statement, but it really sort of starts to shape the way that media sometimes can actually affect and shape people's mindset. And I think we're seeing that in people's actions and so forth. And I want to talk today a little bit about how we should be thinking, how we should be engaging with media, and really thinking about places that can help to expand our minds. You both are amazing writers who really tackle some great subjects, but also thinking about ways that we can also protect ourselves against media that we need to be critically thinking about as well. So I think we can think about how do we use images and discourse for good. And we know that, thinking of the beloved community and the tenets of that amazing community, which really is a sort of global vision that the world can be shared by all people and we can resolve, conflicts peacefully. And so as I think through all of that, I would love to start with one question because we're going to be talking about media today. I think we should first start with saying to both of you, and Mira when she's here, who and what comprises media to you? Ari, I owe you one, so please, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things is the media is so much bigger now than it used to be. I mean, if you were consuming media in the 1960s, I mean, a lot of people were getting their news from, three old white men who were anchoring the major networks. And that was the news, right? I mean, that was, NBC, ABC, CBS. And I mean, there were local journalists, there was lots of other people, but really, a few powerful figures determined what a lot of people saw and heard. Now the media is a lot more democratic. There's a lot of different kind of media. A lot of people get their quote unquote media from things that Jamil and I might not even consider journalism, right? TikTok, lots of other stuff that I don't even understand really these days. And so I think what's interesting is the democratization of the media has been both good and bad in my view. It's been really good in that it's allowed a lot of new voices to be heard. And a lot of people feel reflected in terms of the content that they're able to both produce and consume. The one bad thing is that I worry that some of the standards that have guided media in the past may not be there anymore. And to give an example of that, just look at all the lies that were spread about the 2020 election. A lot of them were spread through very grassroots sources, right? Through Facebook, through lots of different places. And people believed it. But even though it wasn't true, it was really hard to fact check it because the media had become so decentralized. So I think the media means a lot of different things, but I think sometimes we have to distinguish between, for lack of a better word, good media and bad media, because there's so much of it these days.
Indeed. I think Ari makes a good point when basically trying to distinguish really between media and journalism. I think that's really an important distinction. I think that media can be anyone who holds a cell phone these days.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's what media has become. And of course, yes, we still, we can all make our own TikToks or Instagram videos or post whatever we want to a blog, what have you. Frankly, that's how my career as a writer started. But at the same time, we need to understand, if you are one of those people that, you're not necessarily a reporter, and that there are different standards for, spreading information, and that, if you aren't a reporter, which is fine, you just have to be, conscious of what you're putting out into the world and how that's being, that can possibly be interpreted. It's just simply, if you're going to be in the media, let's all have a collective set of standards.
I love that. Hi, Mira. We got you on.
Hi, I was here, but somehow it wasn't coming through. But
oh, no worries. We're happy to have you. If you wanted to maybe just share a little bit about yourself, and then you can roll right in. We're just starting the level set with saying what we feel, who and what media is. So you can take it from there. That way that everyone gets to know you.
Okay. My name is Mira Sorvino. I'm a mother of 4. I'm an actress. I also am an activist. I went to Harvard and I studied Chinese studies, but I wrote a thesis about racial conflict in China between Chinese and African students. I then worked on a documentary about anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union, about the effect of glasnost and perestroika on the empowerment of hate groups and hate speech. And then my acting career kind of took over for a while. And in my mid-30s, I found a way to get really heavily engaged in service on the topics of genocide in Darfur, and then most significantly human trafficking, modern day slavery, which claims over 30 million victims in the world today. There are more slaves living in the world today than at any other point in recorded human history. And I work with the UNODC since 2009. I have been their Goodwill Ambassador to combat human trafficking. I've spoken all over the world. I've hosted a documentary with the CNN Freedom Project called Every Day in Cambodia about child virgin sales there. I've advocated with and helped fundraise for a ton of different NGOs, not only in the US, but across the world in Thailand, Cambodia, Mexico, Spain, England, to name a few. And it's a huge part of my life. And then in 2017, Ronan Farrow interviewed me on the topic of Harvey Weinstein because he heard that I might have a story to tell, because indeed the time that everything happened to me, I did tell it a lot of people and it never went anywhere. And I told the truth and told him that I'd been sexually harassed and assaulted by Harvey Weinstein. And I became part of the Me Too movement. I became a silence breaker. And I think it was there that I saw firsthand the massive impact that media can have. that was one instance where I saw the force of journalism, incredible investigative journalism on the part of Rona Farrow and Megan Twohey and oh my gosh, why am I forgetting the name of the other wonderful journalist who's in, she
Jody
said,
Cantor.
yes, there you go. And she's actually interviewed me. I'm ashamed, but to really expose something that had been an open secret, I suppose, within the industry. I had not been aware that everyone else knew about it, but a lot of people in power understood Harvey Weinstein's predation on at least 100 women, and perhaps many more. But that he was not alone in this. I think the most important part of this was not the individual triumph of taking one predator to justice, which was very important for us victims, but or survivors, but to see the tide shift worldwide and to to join forces with Tarana Burke, who had created the Me Too movement herself in 2007, I believe, which was for her community and for women of color who were experiencing sexual violence, but to see the entire world start to shift its look at sexual harassment in the workplace, sexual violence, and to finally shift a kind of patriarchal, there's that horrible tradition of, the kings being able to take the brides the night of, that feeling of entitlement to use and abuse people of lesser power sexually. Right. We were able to blow that open, and systems are somewhat changing because of that. I think we have a really long way to go, but I think so many people are victims and survivors of sexual violence and harassment, men and women, non-binary people of every ethnicity, age, color, religious persuasion. And I saw the media in that case, even though it was sensationalist, be able to change systems and open hearts with empathy towards the people who had lived through this.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, I'm so sorry that you had to experience that along with the others survivors. I'm thinking about the theme for the King Center's 2023 holiday observance as I was hearing you speak. And the theme is, it starts with me, cultivating a beloved community mindset to transform unjust systems. And so I think that really just kind of goes into what you were saying. And I would love to hear from each of you sort of, how do you think that's applicable, that theme, when talking about media? It sounds like, Mira, you just hit on it, where something that you had been saying and other people have been saying for some time, but now media was used to transform. Ari, thinking about the work that you've done with Mother Jones and calling out the importance of voting rights and discrimination in voting and gerrymandering, and then Jamil, a million different ways that you use your career as a journalist and a producer to shine a light. I would love to just hear, when you're thinking about transforming unjust systems through media, what comes to mind? And again, thinking through the way to responsibly, you hit on that, Jamil, do that. Maybe we could start with you. I'm pointing at you.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind, and hello, Mira, good to see you. What comes to mind, as I was listening to Mira speak, was the fact that, yes, it's all about the individual, but media is a microphone, and it's really about how we use it. And I mean, I've worked in a lot of different areas of media, as you mentioned. I've been a podcaster, I've been a writer, I've cut football movies for the NFL for 6 years, and even there, as you're ostensibly part of a system, right, you can still make a difference. You can still shine a light on things that you see as systemic injustices or things that you think are important. Where I did a documentary about the Rooney Rule and why we needed to go beyond that. And thankfully, the league, thus far has at least taken, very small steps towards some equity in that regard. Needs to take more, and I've written as much. And so even if you're talking about, what is ostensibly entertainment, it's still important that we use that microphone responsibly. And now, as we mentioned earlier, now that the media has been democratized to an effect I think that no one could have fully envisioned, I think that we need to really understand the power that we all have, because ultimately that's what media is. It's about power, about talking, about who is powerful and what they're doing, but also giving power to the people who are speaking, and their voices being articulated, whether it's through an op-ed, whether it's through a protest, whether it's through folks like us who have staff jobs. I mean, it's up to all of us.
Ari, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I got into media because I felt like journalism could be a powerful force for good in the world. And one of the things that actually inspired me was the coverage of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I mean, obviously, Dr. King didn't have a Twitter account, right? So, I mean, they relied on the media to get their message out. And obviously, it took the incredible work of, Dr. King, Coretta Scott King, John Lewis, Diane Nash, so many others to do the work, but it also took the media to be there and to cover it. And often that was something that was very dangerous for them as well. And I think back to, the Bloody Sunday March in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965, when John Lewis and so many others were brutally beaten for voting rights. The TV cameras were there. And ABC cut into its primetime premiere of Judgment at Nuremberg, a film about Nazi Germany, to show the footage from Selma, Alabama. And that's what really captivated the country. And that's what led to the introduction and eventual passage of the Voting Rights Act. If the cameras hadn't been there, if journalists hadn't been there, it would have just been like so many other forgotten protests. So that's what really inspired me to get into journalism. And I think that I still believe that journalism can be that force for good in the world. And what we can do is we can try to cover stories that aren't being covered. Like Mira said, a lot of people knew that these things were going on, but it wasn't being covered. So it didn't really reach the public awareness until it started becoming something that people were seeing in the papers. And, with me and voting rights, I noticed all the way back, after the 2010 election, more than a decade ago, that states were trying to change their laws to make it harder to vote. I thought this was a really big scandal for our democracy and wasn't getting covered. So I just decided to start covering it. And then, I think partly because of my work, a lot of other people started covering it, and then it became a much bigger issue. So I think what we can do at our best is we can try to shine a light on really important things that people don't otherwise know about, and try to make the media a force for good in the world.
Yeah, if I can jump in real quick, that recalls something I actually got the chance to ask John Lewis about. When I interviewed him about 4 years ago this month, and I asked him how important was the press to the civil rights movement, and he said if it hadn't been for the press, the whole struggle would have been like a bird without wings. So we need to understand that at the moment, they understood how important it was that these people be there to witness what was going on, and not just witness it, but then be able to articulate it accurately and powerfully to the people.
It was so profound just thinking about that, and what an amazing experience to be able to talk to such a legendary, person who had so much impact on the movement. I'm thinking as you all are speaking, and I'm thinking about what we put in and how it affects our mindset. But it was something, the point you brought up before, that we keep coming back to the democratization. I spent the last 4 years working to empower and center marginalized communities at Twitter. And part of, during my time there, part of my wanting to do that was the fact that it was this, as you mentioned, Ari, it's not just old white men who are able to say who can be on CNN, who can be on MSNBC, right? And so I think about the fact that the democratization of speech is so important, but it also does require, as you mentioned, Jamil, sort of some different filters of saying, I can open my mind and understand a new perspective, which has been profoundly impactful, especially for people who've been marginalized that have not had that opportunity. But then it also, as you mentioned, should we be getting health advice from TikTok, right? It does mean, so we have to, how do we think about understanding and opening our minds to learning new perspectives, providing a space for people who have often been excluded to share. And then also thinking about the importance of expertise, right? And what that can mean as well. So when we're thinking about what we put in to our minds, and when we're critically thinking, how I would love to kind of know how you all think about those different, I don't know if they're compartments or filters, the way that we sort of ingest information in media today and how it affects our mindset. So Mira, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I know
it's really tough because I think the big problem with the democratization of social media, and therefore kind of the media is that anyone can grab the mic. And some of that is not motivated by our better angels. Some of that is disinformation. Some of that is hate. Some of that is divisive intentionally. And, sometimes I really ponder, like, how do we reach people who are ingesting this steady stream of anti-Black, anti-woman, anti-minority, anti-Indigenous, anti-migrant, cant? How do we illuminate the fact that that is a kind of a negative propaganda rather than truth-based, humanity-based, love-based, intelligence-based news? The idea that there's a guy on TikTok who's, Andrew Tate, the whole thing about, him sort of promoting himself as a rapist, like that kind of guy can get a lot of followers and then a lot of young influenced by
from
him.
young men.
That's terrifying, right? Or all the white supremacy websites or the channels, there's really some incredible exposés of people going undercover and going. Sorry, my speaker. Stop it. Just the incredible power of this recruitment, and I think part of what we need to somehow do is have this revolution of love again, which is, I know the beloved community is founded on this, but sorry, my dog is being so.
Okay. Jamil, you want to jump in? Well,
I was going to say, sounds like he agrees with what Mira is saying.
I know he felt passionate about
that. Sorry. So that's
all good.
Can I just to go back to the earlier question about it starts with you. If I can say anything about my foundation, it literally came from my parents' engagement with the ideals of the civil rights movement, the ideals of service. My mother actually, as a young college student, marched on Washington with Dr. King. My father's greatest hero was Dr. King. And when he died, my father said he went to bed for a week and cried for a week and couldn't get out of bed. And my mother was completely engaged in volunteerism and service. She used to go to this place called Helpline, Norman Vincent Peale's anti-suicide hotline, where she would talk people down from ledges 3 hours in a day and then come back and tell us about it. And there was no money. It was just service. And so somehow, the ideals of our culture through media have to be sort of turned back to love, because I think right now there is so much emphasis on the externals, success, money, just what we are putting our lenses on, youth, transformation visually. Like if you look at Instagram and look at the stuff that's aimed at women my age, it's all about facelifts. I mean, it's all about changing yourself to be more beautiful, to look more eternally youthful. And where is that ethos and pathos of the ideal of the beloved community? I grew up reading the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's autobiography. I've recently read Mrs. Coretta Scott King's book, and that's how I became really sort of interested in this ongoing concept of this community. And how do we engage people at a heart empathy level? How do we get them to see the humanity in every face and every soul, rather than just sensationalism and clickbait and shallowness? And I think it's a real problem. And I think we're all kind of, sucked in by the flashy things. And how do we help infuse a love-based and truth-based and equity-based morality into the message that's going out there? Because otherwise, I think the Roman Empire is doomed to fall. We're just spinning out into a lack of morality, a lack of love, a lack of empathy. And even though I do think many, many more diverse voices are being heard, I think also there's all of this terribleness being heard as well now on the rise, all this Holocaust denial. I don't know. I'm looking to you guys for answers, but how do we put out a responsible, loving, ethical media that engages people on a heart and gut level rather than just satisfying some need for kind of media addiction.
Right. I want to, and I think the love piece was so important. Jamel, I'd love your thoughts on thinking, oh, here we go.
Sorry, I hit the
Don't
wrong
leave me
button
now.
there. I hit the wrong button. I think that's a really powerful word that Mira's giving us. And I think that one of the things that makes me think about is how do we use media to essentially help people understand the effects of what's going on out here? And I think what we do, is cater to this new media sphere's biggest strength, which is catering to people's self-interest. And I found that in my work, it hasn't changed everyone's minds, certainly. But when I say, for instance, help people understand on a person-to-person level, what, how white supremacy hurts them as white people. How, we've just seen now how, white people are dying at a higher rate than Black folks, despite the disproportionate disadvantages that we have in terms of life expectancy and in healthcare and all these different factors. White people are still dying at higher rates than Black folks, due to COVID. And, people out here pretending like this pandemic is over. And one of the things I found was really interesting was a comment a colleague of mine made, which is that, a lot of folks, in that vein, who might thought the pandemic was nothing to begin with, they didn't recognize it as a threat because it primarily threatened us. And it wasn't a threat to them. And it wasn't a sense of community on their part. What we need to do as storytellers within the media of all sorts, in all shapes and sizes, is to help people understand our commonality. And, even the commonality of our faults. I think one of the most important pieces of media that we saw this past year was the movie Nope, which helped us really understand our addiction to spectacle. And if we can use that spectacle to help shine light upon the powerful and help people understand their own power, perhaps it can be a good thing. It's not always a bad thing.
I love that. And thank you for making that note on Nope. It was a lot of discourse, I'm sure, as you know, I think a lot of people sort of went over their heads, and it was very clear to me that was sort of the foundation of what he was trying to say, or Jordan Peele. Ari, I'd love any thoughts you have on input. Then we're going to talk output and what we're putting out into the world for others to consume.
Well, I think that Jamil made a really good point earlier about the difference between journalism and media. When I write a story, it goes through an editing process. And the reason it goes through an editing process is because the editing process makes it better, right? And in the past, having a lot of gatekeepers left a lot of people out. There's no doubt about it. But it's also was the case that there was a common set of standards in media that pretty much everyone adhered to. And when you just kind of give everyone a microphone, but it doesn't go through that kind of training, it doesn't go through that kind of editing, I think it can empower a lot of new and diverse voices, but it could also empower, like Mira said, a lot of hate and disinformation. And I think it's important to understand what democracy is. Democracy is not just giving everyone a platform to say whatever they want. Democracy in its best form is about empowering other ideals. It's about empowering justice and representation and all of those other things. And if you think back to democracy as a concept, the reason why Dr. King and John Lewis and so many others were so passionate about democracy was because it was a means to an end. It was a means to a better world, right? It was a means to equal justice. It was a means to better jobs and better housing and ultimately being treated with fundamental human dignity. That's why they embraced democracy. If they could have gotten those things some other way, they might have embraced some other ideology. But democracy was the best route to equal justice. And so I think when we think about democracy of the media, we have to think about it's not just giving people a lot of different platforms. It's also about trying to uphold those ideals with those platforms. And that's where I worry that if you have no standards on Twitter anymore, and if you have no standards on Facebook, and if no one's even looking at TikTok, then who is responsible for those ends. And then I think right now what we're seeing is media, the door is opening to a lot of abuse in these different media spheres because a lot of the standards have gone away, or people have very specifically said, we don't want those standards to be in place anymore.
I mean, I think that brings us to the next point is you think about all the other kind of systems where people accept, they are expecting rigor. You go to a dentist or a doctor, can't just be anybody. Like, you know what I mean? You would never accept that, And so I think it's so interesting because you're absolutely right, Ari. It's the idea that people are also saying, I actively don't want these standards. I actively don't want to know there was an editing process, or that there's some type of methodology that allows this to be something that I should consume. So I think that leads me to thinking about, how does what we put out affect our mindsets, individually, but what is the responsibility? And I think about, again, really trying to create that beloved community. I feel like all of us here on this, in this conversation today want to get to that. You talked about means to an end. How do we get to this place? But how, especially as, artists and journalists, you're putting things out into the world, sort of how do you rationalize with yourself, this is what I'm doing, this is the way that I want to shape the mind? And I think there's another part to this question. Sorry, I'm making it long, but you all have been just sparking so much, so many thoughts for me, is also going back to sort of where we are thinking about hate speech, thinking about things, is that as you all put things out in the world, you're combating that actively as well. And so I think there's a level of self-care and thinking through how to responsibly do this because you have responsibility, but also understanding sort of what it takes in today's world. So I'd love anyone who wants to jump in. I feel like this is a really interesting topic. You all have a great day. Jamel, you excited?
Yeah, if I may, I'm like,
please.
I just think that, one of the fundamental duties I feel like for artists, for journalists, is to tell the truth. And, we are unfortunately right now in the midst of not just other media figures who would like to spread disinformation, but also, governmental figures. I mean, we have people literally trying to change the definitions of words, say like racism, to suit their ideological goals. So what can we do? One of the things I think is really important that we do is do what Ari just did. It was just help to demystify the work that we do. A lot of people don't understand what journalists do. I certainly don't know what it's like to be on a movie set, and I'll have Mira speak to that. But I don't think that people understand fully why journalism and our standards are important, and why that this whole thing just needs to be spelled out in a different way for people. So that's really, I think that. Hopefully that can help, people understand a little bit better. I'm not sure if that will bring people together, but I do think it's an essential duty that we have.
I love that. As a journalism major, I agree. I don't think people realize all of the ways we were judged and graded and had to learn this process to try and prevent, what we're seeing now to a degree. So yes, Mira, if you want to jump in on that.
Well, I guess my perspective is a little different as if I talk about my performer side rather than my advocacy side. Like I can try and actively choose projects that don't demean people and that speak some positive aspect to the human spirit. I have very definitely turned down projects in the past that I felt were sexist or nihilist or cruel. But I think it is about proactively creating content. I mean, I think, in whatever sphere you are, the journalistic, the entertainment field, the personal social media, each voice has a drop, and then it has ripple effects that you can't estimate. The day that the Ronan Farrow, because it was very hard for me to go public with the Ronan Farrow thing, because I already had been struggling with a sort of diminished career for about 20 years. And I did not realize it was due to blacklisting, but that was what it was. But, and Ronan reached out to me, and I thought it was because he wanted to talk to me about like kind of coming out about Woody Allen and whether I had an opinion on Woody Allen. And I called him, which I later wrote an open letter of apology to Dylan Farrow, supporting her and denouncing Woody, something I should have done far earlier, but I didn't really understand the situation well enough. And that's my fault. And when he said, I hear you might have to say something about, you might have something to say about Harvey Weinstein, I just burst into tears. And then I was so afraid that Harvey would take away the last vestiges of the career that I had that was, basically eking by on independent films that no one got to see, because even if they were quality, they were so low budget that they never got promoted.
Right.
Or, sort of smaller parts on television, no movies of note, like for 20 years, where I had been an Oscar winning actress, so I thought, well, I'm going to lose all of my employment now. I won't be able to feed my family. What am I going to do? And I called my minister, who was a woman, really incredible person. I spoke to my family, my husband, and I just felt compelled that I had to come forward and speak, and I was like, well, what can I do? I guess I can apply to the UN for a regular job rather than a volunteer one, because I do have expertise in human trafficking, and I could do that. So, I just sort of was like, all right, this is my moment to use my platform, even if it personally may bring harm to me, for the greater good. Even though I've been doing advocacy for other people for years, it's time for me to personally involve myself. And the one thing I know that it directly affected, even though I have no idea how my personal involvement involved anybody else, it affected anyone else. The half an hour after the Ronan article came out, I got a phone call, and it was Annabella Shora. And she said, Mira, we've known each other for 25 years. Harvey raped me.
Oh my gosh.
I just stayed on the phone with her for like an hour and consoled her and said I was so sorry that I didn't know. And, because people don't talk among themselves about sexual violence because there's a lot of shame, right?
Right.
And then I, over time, convinced her that it would be a good idea for her to come forward too. And that led to her eventually becoming a Molyneux witness in Harvey's New York case. And even though her rape was beyond the statute of limitations, even though later I worked to get the statute of limitations extended for rape victims in New York, which we successfully extended them, but hers was before that cutoff grandfather date. I believe her testimony, her honesty, her bravery on the stand is what got Harvey convicted for someone else's assault.
Right.
And like that had a snowball effect that led to, people perhaps believing some of the witnesses, some of the defendant, the survivors in this recent LA case, even though they didn't convict him on all counts, including Jennifer Siebel Newsom's, which was insane. But that one decision for me to be brave and to put myself out there in the media, being very truthful and very painful, because it was super painful, right?
Right.
And people saw that pain, led to one other woman being able to speak her truth and having a very concrete effect, not only on Harvey's case, but on any other predator of power who can be brought to justice. To see a successful conviction or convictions allows other prosecutors the ability to use rule of law to actually bring systems back into some sort of justice-related equilibrium, rather than just allowing perpetrators to go unchecked because there's no history of success of checking them. So I think that's where we each have our own space to use our insides and put them outside. And I think that revolution begins with all of us, and we don't know where it's going to end. We just don't know.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's such an impactful, example of, like you said, an output that literally changed legislation. It changed someone else, another survivor's, story and courage to come forward. And I think it's really interesting. And that, like you mentioned, the ripple or the drop, it creates such a ripple effect. But going back to that risk, you did take a lot of personal risk. And I'd love to, Ari, your thoughts on sort of balancing. I mean, you're writing at The Nation, you're writing about, politics in real time, and often things that are not, above the line and things that are nefarious. And it's a personal risk in doing that. So how do you balance that with the output that you put when you think about media and your role?
Well, I think the reason that politicians try to do a lot of terrible undemocratic things is they think they can get away with them, right? And I think one of the reasons they think they can get away with them is that nobody's either going to know about them or nobody's going to care.
Right.
And when I was starting to cover the attack on voting rights, I mean, both of those things were happening, right? I mean, a lot of laws were being passed, early on at the beginning of the decade, by Republicans in these red states, in Florida and Ohio and Pennsylvania, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of people, first off, just weren't even aware that it was happening.
Right.
But also, B, I think, the politicians themselves felt like, we're entrenching our own power. We can do whatever we want. And there were much larger forces behind this. And I think it took, a lot of explanation for people to understand, that this was a fundamental attack on democracy, and to also understand, why it mattered. And also, I think, one of the things that we can do in the media is try to explain things in a way that people can understand. A lot of people, for example, when, Republicans were passing voter ID laws, you would hear all the time, what's the big deal? Everyone has an ID. And so you would have to, as members of the media, we would have to go out, we'd have to find people, who didn't have these IDs, or who had been purged from the voting rolls, and who had their polling place closed, or who were gerrymandered to limit their representation. They were victims also, and it was a different kind of victimization, but they were victims of a system that was trying to oppress them, right? And they weren't necessarily on the news every single day, because there's lots of different factors that goes into voter suppression. One of the things that voter suppression does is it highlights existing socioeconomic disparities that exist in our society.
Right.
So the people that are going to be on the receiving end of these efforts, they're not going to have the same kind of megaphone as the Speaker of the House might have, right?
Right.
And so I think that, a lot of my job was to find these stories, to make them compelling, and to get people to try to care. And, when you're talking about politics, or you're talking about the law, I think it's really important that we don't just think of these people as, statistics, but we try to bring the stories alive. Every time there's a lawsuit filed, there are names on that lawsuit, right? The case that challenged the Voting Rights Act was called Shelby County versus Holder. Holder was Eric Holder, the Attorney General, but who was Shelby County? It was a county in Alabama with a long history of discrimination that was challenging this landmark civil rights law. And so I think it's really important to tell those stories. And I think so the same thing, could happen with me too, right, Mira, where, you see these names, this person, but you don't understand. This is everything that went into it. And so I think, whether it's Harvey Weinstein, or whether it's Donald Trump, or whether it's the leader of the North Carolina State House, I mean, these are powerful people, who have a lot of vested interest in maintaining a status quo that has benefited them, but hurt a lot of other people in the process.
That's such a great example. And I think about, just growing up in school, I don't even remember being taught like what gerrymandering was. It just sort of glazed over it. Everything that I've really come to understand is so often from articles and discussions from journalists like yourself. So I think that that's such an interesting point, and important. I'm also thinking, as I was thinking about how we can do better, Jamil, your point of thinking, how do we teach people why this is important, what goes into it? But almost thinking about starting, there's a lot of conversation about young people, right? I think you brought up we talked about young men who were unfortunately being influenced negatively. Right. But I'm thinking about if in our final minutes, I'd love to know, Ari's back. I'd love to know sort of how you all would maybe give advice to younger people who only know a world of 24/7 news, of everything is all the
Mhm.
time, right? I remember the news, I remember the TV going off. I know I might not look that old, I hope not, but people don't remember that, right? But now it's all for my daughter who's
Mhm.
11. She doesn't know a world where there's not 24/7 news, there's not TikToks all the time. And so I think about how when you think about how media influences people both intentionally and unintentionally, what sort of advice or what kind of, just I guess best practices would you give
Mhm.
to someone when they think about how they're building their media competency and shaping who they are and how they understand the world? I would love to know that, especially thinking about the world now as it exists
Mhm.
with so much to consume. Jamil, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, three things off the top of my head. One, bigotry is cowardice. So, what do we do to combat that? We must be curious. You have to be curious, not just about what's going on in the world, but also about the people who are telling the stories, and that's important. Second of all, the people who were having the stories told about. One of the big reasons I got into journalism is because I had a cousin who was murdered when I was 15 years old, and there was nothing in the papers about him. Tell the stories that aren't being told, and in combat dehumanization with humanization. Use the powerful tools of social media, for instance, that shine a light on each of us as individuals, to shine a light on human beings. And lastly, think critically. You have to be thinking critically,
Yeah.
whether you're reading, stuff that Ari and I write, whether you're reading or seeing something in other news outlets. Make sure that you are thinking critically about the information that you're getting.
I love that. Mira, you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that, in thinking about these kids with the 24/7 stream, and I definitely see my kids, like like such a rule
Me
about
too.
like not having the phone at the table. But uh I think somehow we have to make it attractive. We have to catch people with that humanization, and also perhaps with a message of empowerment of like somehow we show the issue, and then we create an avenue for the person to get involved in a positive, proactive way.
Mm.
I know that's very idealistic, but I feel there's just so much negative media out there, or just like today, this terrible thing happened, blah, 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 blah. But
Right.
some kind of creation of content, which really became almost like a movement of volunteerism, of engagement, of here's what you can do. And I've been talking to people about creating some kind of a docu-series where we look at various issues around the world that affect women in different countries, and then highlight a specific problem, whether it's genital mutilation or child marriage, or different issues, and then focus on people who are doing the work already well, with positive, engaging stories of how they're
Right.
getting it done, and then amplifying it and finding ways to enlist people to become part of that beloved community of action and solidarity and progress, rather than the disengagement that comes from channel surfing, and I know maybe it's a lot to ask, and maybe I don't have all the answers and ways to do it, but if there can be a piece of media that engages and says, now it's your turn and you can do this too, and you're going to feel really good about it, that it has to somehow give them that serotonin,
Shift the mindset.
right, like that it's not hopeless. And I think us people who are not kids anymore, we can be overwhelmed. I mean, I go through my Twitter feed and sometimes I'm just like, just it's so depressing.
Doom
And
scrolling.
I'm not even talking about Twitter right now, but just traditionally there's so much bad news out there that you can get a little bit like glossed over. And
Yeah.
if we can try and actively give people their own tools to effect change, and then that always has a good feeling to it. I mean, I think when people actually are part of something that is for the betterment of others and themselves, it always feels good. So
I
if
agree.
we somehow create that positive, serotonin rewarding, like, experience of media that outlines a problem with expertise, with heart, with empathy for the individuals in it, and then gives the watcher, the viewer, the scanner, the chance to get involved and themselves become part of that solution. And I don't have the answers of how to do this, but this seems to be important somehow.
Well, sounds like a great idea. I love it. Ari, I think we have about 60 seconds. Do you want to close us out and your thoughts?
Sure. Well, I would just say that truth, justice, and empathy have been my guiding lights as a journalist. And I think those are just good values in life as well. And so I think that people should look at the media through that lens, that yes, entertainment is important. And but ultimately, the media is an end, or should be an end, and journalism should be an end for these values of truth, justice, and empathy. And hopefully that's what guides our work. And hopefully that's what guides the next generation, that they might do things differently, right? They're going to have different platforms. They're going to have different ways of expressing themselves.
Right.
But ultimately, if those are the values that we can instill in them, then I think that media can continue to be a force for good in the world.
Oh, I love that. What an amazing way to end our time together. This has been such an awesome conversation. Thank you to the King Center, to Bernice King, to the entire team, and to all the awesome panelists. Thank you all so much. I know there's more conversations to continue, so stay tuned. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Appreciate it.